My name is Sarah Chen, and 6 months ago, I was just another fresh graduate with a master's in international relations from Georgetown, sitting in a cramped cubicle at the CIA's Langley headquarters, surrounded by analysts who had been doing this job since before I was born. They called me the rookie, with the kind of condescending smile that suggested I should be grateful. They even acknowledged my existence. I remember my first day vividly, August 15th, walking through those imposing marble corridors with my visitors' badge still warm from the laminator, trying not to gawk at the memorial wall while my supervisor, Deputy Director Patricia Hawkins, led me to what would become my workspace for the next several months. The cubicle was barely 6 feet by 6 feet, wedged between a copy machine that jammed every other Tuesday and a water cooler that gurgled ominously throughout the day. "This is where you'll be working," Patricia said, her tone professional but not unkind. "You'll be part of the East Asia desk, focusing on economic intelligence analysis. Nothing too exciting to start with, trade reports, economic indicators, that sort of thing." I nodded enthusiastically, though internally I was fighting disappointment. I hadn't spent 4 years studying Mandarin, Korean, and Japanese, hadn't written my thesis on emerging cyber warfare threats in the Pacific Rim, to analyze export numbers and currency fluctuations. But I was 24 years old, female, and Asian American in an agency that, despite its efforts at modernization, still operated like an old boys club where respect was earned through decades of service rather than competence or insight. My colleagues were polite but distant. There was James Morrison, a 40-something analyst who had been tracking North Korean activities since the Clinton administration and spoke about Kim Jong-il like he was an old acquaintance. Margaret Wells specialized in Chinese economic policy and had the kind of institutional knowledge that came from watching 3 decades of reforms unfold in real time. David Park, the only other Asian American on our team, had been there for 8 years and seemed to view my arrival as either a threat to his unique status or evidence that the agency was filling some kind of quota. "Just remember," David told me during my first week, "this isn't school anymore. Here, being smart isn't enough. You need to understand how things work, who to listen to, when to speak up, and more importantly, when to keep your mouth shut." His advice stung because it carried the implicit message that my academic achievements, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, fluent in 4 languages, meant nothing in this environment. I was starting at the bottom, and the climb would be steep. My initial assignments were mind-numbingly routine. I analyzed shipping manifests, cross-referenced trade data, and wrote reports that felt more like homework assignments than intelligence analysis. Every morning, I would arrive at 7:30 a.m., review overnight cables from our stations in Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing, and compile briefings that would work their way up the chain of command, usually without my name attached. The frustration was compounded by the casual sexism that permeated the workplace. During meetings, my comments were often ignored until a male colleague repeated the same point minutes later, suddenly making it worthy of discussion. When I suggested that certain economic indicators might be masking more significant security concerns, I was told that I should focus on staying in my lane and building expertise before trying to connect dots that more senior analysts had already considered, but I didn't let the dismissive attitudes discourage me. Instead, I used my supposed irrelevance as an advantage. While my colleagues focused on their established areas of expertise, I began to notice patterns that crossed traditional boundaries. My background in cybersecurity, combined with my language skills, allowed me to identify connections that others missed. It started with something small. While reviewing Chinese trade data, I noticed irregularities in technology exports that didn't match the official numbers being reported to international organizations. The discrepancies were subtle, just a few percentage points, but they suggested that significant quantities of semiconductor components were being shipped to destinations that weren't appearing in the official records. I spent my lunch breaks researching, cross-referencing shipping logs with customs declarations, and tracking the movement of specific technologies through a maze of subsidiary companies and shell corporations. What I discovered was a sophisticated network designed to circumvent export controls on dual-use technologies, components that could be used for civilian purposes but also had military applications. When I tried to bring this to my supervisors' attention, she listened politely but ultimately suggested that I might be overthinking what were probably just clerical errors or legitimate business arrangements that I didn't fully understand. Sarah, she said, leaning back in her chair with the patient expression of someone explaining something to a child, these are complex international business relationships. What looks irregular to you might make perfect sense to someone with more experience in commercial intelligence. But I couldn't let it go. The patterns were too clear, too systematic to be coincidental. I began working late, staying in the office until security started asking questions, using my access to classified databases to trace the technological components further downstream. What I found changed everything. The components weren't just being sold to commercial entities. They were ending up in military research facilities in countries that weren't supposed to have access to American technology. More troubling, some of the technologies were being used in weapons systems that could threaten U.S. forces and allies. In the region, I documented everything meticulously, creating a presentation that traced the flow of technology from American manufacturers through a complex network of intermediaries to foreign military programs. I showed how shell companies in Singapore and Hong Kong were being used to obscure the true end users of the technology, and how timing of the shipments corresponded with known weapons development programs. When I finally presented my findings to Patricia, her expression changed from polite attention to genuine concern. She asked detailed questions, requested additional documentation, and then did something that surprised me. She scheduled a meeting with the section chief. Section Chief Robert Matthews was a legend in the agency, a man who had served in the field during the Cold War and had the kind of gravitas that made even senior analysts nervous. I had never spoken to him directly, had only seen him in all-hands meetings where he delivered updates about geopolitical developments with the authority of someone who had witnessed history firsthand. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday, in Matthew's corner office that overlooked the Potomac River. I spent the morning rehearsing my presentation, anticipating every possible question, and trying to calm my nerves. This was my chance to prove that I was more than just a rookie analyst, that I could contribute meaningfully to the agency's mission. When I walked into Matthew's office, I was surprised to find 3 other people present: Patricia, Director of Analysis Catherine Sterling, and a man I didn't recognize who introduced himself simply as Tom from Counterintelligence. Ms. Chan, Matthews said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk, I've reviewed your preliminary report. It's concerning. I'd like you to walk us through your analysis. For the next 30 minutes, I presented my findings, explaining how I had identified the irregularities, traced the technology transfers, and documented the connections to foreign weapons programs. I showed them the evidence methodically, building the case piece by piece, demonstrating not just what was happening, but why it mattered for national security. When I finished, the room was quiet for several seconds. Then Tom from Counterintelligence leaned forward and asked the question I had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Ms. Chen, how confident are you in these conclusions? Very confident, I replied. I've triple-checked the data, verified the connections through multiple sources, and consulted with technical experts to confirm the dual-use nature of these components. This isn't speculation, it's happening, and it's been happening for at least 18 months. Matthews and Sterling exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret. Then Matthews turned back to me with an expression that was somehow both proud and worried. Ms. Chan, you've uncovered what appears to be a significant intelligence operation designed to circumvent U.S. export controls and provide foreign adversaries with advanced military technology. This is exactly the kind of analysis we need: thorough, methodical, and fearless. He paused, then continued, I'm reassigning you to a joint task force that will investigate this network further. You'll be working directly with counterintelligence and coordinating with other agencies. This won't be routine analysis anymore, you'll be at the center of an active investigation that could have significant implications for national security. As I left Matthew's office that afternoon, I felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. In the span of a few months, I had gone from analyzing trade statistics to uncovering an international technology transfer scheme. The rookie label hadn't disappeared. I could still see it in the way some colleagues looked at me, but something had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just another analyst buried in a cubicle. I was someone whose work mattered, whose insights could influence policy and protect national security. It was exactly what I had hoped for when I joined the agency, but it came with a weight of responsibility that I was only beginning to understand that evening. As I drove home through the Virginia suburbs, I reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 6 months earlier, I had been a graduate student writing papers about theoretical security threats. Now I was investigating real threats that could affect the safety of American forces and allies around the world. I didn't know it yet, but the technology transfer investigation would be just the beginning. In the months ahead, I would face challenges that would test not only my analytical skills but my judgment, my courage, and my ability to operate in a world where the stakes were measured in lives rather than grades. The rookie phase of my career was ending, but the real test was just beginning. The Joint Task Force met in a secure conference room on the 6th floor of the CIA headquarters, a windowless space lined with soundproofing and equipped with the kind of technology that made cell phones useless and conversations impossible to intercept. When I walked in for my first meeting, I was surprised to find representatives from the FBI, NSA, Treasury Department, and Commerce Department, along with several people whose agencies weren't identified on their business cards. The task force was led by Assistant Director Michael Torres from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, a man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested he had spent decades hunting spies and terrorists. He introduced me to the team with a mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed skepticism. Ms. Chen is the analyst who identified the technology transfer network, he said, his tone suggesting that while my work was appreciated, my youth and inexperience were noted. She'll be providing ongoing analysis and helping us understand the intelligence implications of what we're seeing. What I discovered over the next several weeks was that my initial findings were just the tip of an iceberg. The technology transfer network wasn't just about circumventing export controls, it was part of a broader intelligence operation designed to acquire American military and commercial technologies for foreign weapons programs. The investigation revealed connections to academic institutions, defense contractors, and even some government employees who were either knowingly or unknowingly facilitating the technology transfers. My role in the task force evolved quickly from providing analysis to actively participating in the investigation. My language skills proved invaluable when we began intercepting communications between the various entities involved in the network. I spent hours listening to recorded phone calls in Mandarin and Korean, translating documents, and interpreting cultural nuances that helped us understand the relationships between different players in the network. The breakthrough came 3 months into the investigation when I identified a pattern in the timing of the technology transfers that suggested coordination with a broader intelligence operation. While analyzing shipping records, I noticed that the movement of sensitive components often coincided with academic conferences, trade missions, and cultural exchanges. It wasn't random, someone was using legitimate business and academic activities as cover for intelligence collection. Look at this, I said during one of our weekly briefings, pointing to a timeline I had created that overlaid technology transfers with academic events. Every major shipment corresponds with a conference or trade mission where Chinese researchers would have access to American technical experts. Tom from Counterintelligence, whose full name, I had learned, was Thomas Bradley, and who had spent 15 years tracking foreign intelligence operations, studied my timeline with growing interest. "You're suggesting this isn't just about acquiring technology," he said. "It's about acquiring knowledge, getting access to the people who understand how the technology works and how it can be improved." "Exactly," I replied. "They're not just stealing products, they're stealing expertise. And they're using our own openness, our academic conferences, our trade relationships, our cultural exchanges, as the mechanism for doing it." This insight shifted the entire focus of our investigation. Instead of just tracking technology transfers, we began monitoring the conferences and events where these exchanges were taking place. We identified researchers and engineers who were being systematically targeted by foreign intelligence services, often without realizing it. The investigation led us to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a materials scientist at Stanford University who had been developing advanced composite materials for aerospace applications. Dr. Walsh had been attending international conferences for over a decade, presenting her research and collaborating with colleagues from around the world. She had no idea that her Chinese collaborators were actually intelligence operatives systematically extracting information about her work. When we approached Dr. Walsh, she was initially defensive and skeptical. As a respected scientist with a spotless record, she couldn't believe that her research collaborations were being exploited for intelligence purposes. But when I showed her the pattern of technology transfers that corresponded with her conference presentations, and the sophisticated nature of the intelligence operation we had uncovered, she began to understand the scope of what was happening. They were so professional, so knowledgeable, she told me during one of our debriefings. I never suspected that they were anything other than legitimate researchers. They asked intelligent questions, proposed meaningful collaborations, and seemed genuinely interested in advancing the science. Dr. Walsh's cooperation became crucial to our investigation. With her help, we were able to identify the specific technologies that foreign intelligence services were targeting and the methods they were using to acquire them. More importantly, we began to understand the broader strategy behind the operation. It wasn't just about stealing individual technologies, but about systematically acquiring the knowledge base needed to compete with and potentially surpass American technological capabilities. As the investigation progressed, my role in the task force became increasingly important. Assistant Director Torres began asking for my assessment on strategic questions, seeking my perspective on the implications of our findings for U.S. national security. The other analysts on the task force, many with decades more experience than me, began treating me as a peer rather than a junior colleague. The validation was professionally satisfying, but it also came with increasing pressure. The technologies being targeted weren't just commercial products, they had direct applications for missile guidance systems, stealth technology, and advanced radar systems. The intelligence operation we were investigating could potentially shift the military balance in the Pacific region and threaten the security of American forces and allies. 6 months into the task force's work, we had identified over 40 individuals who were being targeted by foreign intelligence services, documented the theft of technologies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and traced the intelligence network to its operational headquarters in Beijing. Our investigation had grown from my initial observation about irregular trade data to a comprehensive understanding of one of the most sophisticated technology transfer operations ever discovered, but our success also created new challenges. The intelligence we had gathered was extremely sensitive, involving not just foreign intelligence operations but also vulnerabilities in American academic and commercial institutions. The question of how to use our intelligence, whether to pursue prosecutions, implement new security measures, or take other actions, required careful consideration at the highest levels of government. It was Assistant Director Torres who first suggested that our findings needed to be briefed to senior policymakers, including members of the National Security Council. The implications of the intelligence operation we had uncovered were too significant to be handled at the agency level alone. Ms. Chen, he said during one of our final task force meetings, I want you to prepare a comprehensive briefing on our findings. You understand this operation better than anyone else on the team, and you've been instrumental in every major breakthrough we've had. The prospect of briefing senior government officials was both thrilling and terrifying. I had been in government service for less than a year, and the idea of presenting my analysis to people who made decisions affecting national security seemed almost surreal. But as I prepared the briefing over the following weeks, I realized how much I had learned and grown since my first day at Langley. I was no longer the nervous graduate student who had been assigned to analyze trade statistics. I had become an intelligence professional who could identify complex threats, lead investigations, and provide actionable insights to policymakers. The briefing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December, in the Eisenhower Executive Office building adjacent to the White House. As I reviewed my notes one final time, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 months earlier, I had been dismissed as a rookie who didn't understand how things worked. Now I was about to brief senior officials on an intelligence operation that threatened fundamental American interests. The transformation hadn't been easy. I had faced skepticism, condescension, and the constant pressure to prove myself in an environment where mistakes could have life or death consequences. But I had also discovered capabilities I didn't know I possessed, the ability to see patterns others missed, to persevere through complex investigations, and to maintain clarity and focus under pressure. As I walked through the security checkpoint at the EEOB, badge in hand and briefing materials in my secure bag, I reflected on what I had learned about intelligence work and about myself. Success in this field wasn't just about being smart or hardworking, it was about having the confidence to trust your instincts, the persistence to follow evidence wherever it led, and the courage to speak truth to power. The rookie phase of my career was definitively over. Whatever happened in the briefing ahead, I knew I had earned my place in this world through competence, dedication, and results. The question now was whether I was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The briefing room in the Eisenhower Executive Office building was smaller than I had expected, with dark wood paneling and portraits of former presidents looking down from the walls with expressions that seemed to judge the worthiness of current deliberations. As I set up my presentation materials, I tried to calm my nerves by focusing on the technical details, testing the projector, organizing my slides, reviewing my notes one final time. The attendees began arriving at 9:45 a.m. for the 10 a.m. briefing. National Security Advisor David Richardson entered first, a man in his early 60s whose reputation for analytical rigor was legendary throughout the intelligence community. He was followed by Deputy Secretary of Defense Maria Santos, FBI Director James Murphy, and several other officials whose titles and responsibilities I knew from organizational charts but had never imagined I would be addressing directly. The last person to enter was someone I hadn't expected, President Elizabeth Morrison herself, accompanied by her chief of staff and a small security detail. She was smaller in person than she appeared on television, but her presence filled the room with an energy that made everyone unconsciously straighten their posture. Ms. Chan, National Security Advisor Richardson said, "I understand you've uncovered something significant. The president has asked to be briefed directly on your findings." For a moment, I was speechless. In less than a year, I had gone from analyzing trade statistics in a cramped cubicle to briefing the President of the United States on matters of national security. The magnitude of the moment threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. "Thank you, Mr. Richardson," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "What I'm about to present is the result of a 9-month investigation into a sophisticated foreign intelligence operation targeting American technology." For the next 45 minutes, I walked through our findings methodically, explaining how a routine analysis of trade data had revealed a comprehensive technology transfer network, how we had traced the operation to its sources, and what the implications were for American national security. I showed them the evidence we had gathered, the scope of the technologies being targeted, and the sophistication of the methods being used. President Morrison listened intently, asking precise questions that demonstrated her grasp of both the technical and strategic implications of what I was presenting. Her questions weren't just about the intelligence operation itself, but about the broader vulnerabilities it revealed in American academic and commercial institutions. "Ms. Chen," she said during a pause in the briefing, "help me understand the full scope of what we're facing. Is this operation unique, or are we looking at a systematic vulnerability in how we protect our technological advantages?" It was exactly the right question, the one that got to the heart of why this investigation mattered for American security and competitiveness. "Madam President," I replied, "our investigation suggests this is part of a broader strategy to systematically acquire American technological capabilities across multiple sectors. The operation we've uncovered in the technology sector appears to be a model that's being replicated in biotechnology, aerospace, artificial intelligence, and other critical industries." I explained how the intelligence operation exploited American openness, our university system, our research collaborations, our commercial relationships, to acquire not just products but the underlying knowledge needed to compete with and potentially surpass American capabilities. "The challenge," I continued, "is that the same openness that makes us vulnerable also makes us innovative. Restricting research collaborations and commercial relationships might reduce our vulnerabilities, but it could also undermine the collaborative environment that drives American technological leadership." President Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "So we need solutions that protect our advantages without sacrificing them." "Exactly, Madam President. And that requires a more sophisticated approach than we've traditionally used, one that distinguishes between legitimate collaboration and intelligence exploitation, that protects sensitive technologies without stifling innovation." The briefing concluded with a discussion of potential responses, ranging from diplomatic protests to new security measures to targeted prosecutions. But what struck me most was the president's focus on long-term strategy rather than immediate reactions. Ms. Chan, she said as the meeting was wrapping up, I want you to work directly with the National Security Council staff to develop a comprehensive response to what you've uncovered. This isn't just about one intelligence operation, it's about how we protect American technological leadership in an era of strategic competition. As the other officials filed out of the room, President Morrison asked me to stay behind. When we were alone except for her chief of staff, she turned to me with an expression that was both serious and encouraging. Sarah, may I call you Sarah, what you've accomplished in your first year is remarkable. You've identified a threat that more senior analysts missed, led an investigation that revealed vulnerabilities we didn't know we had, and provided analysis that will shape how we think about protecting American interests. She paused, then continued. I'm creating a new position, Senior Director for Technology Security on the National Security Council staff. It will be your responsibility to coordinate government-wide efforts to protect American technological advantages while maintaining our competitive edge. Are you interested? I was so stunned that for several seconds I couldn't speak. A year ago, I had been a graduate student writing theoretical papers about international security. Now the president was offering me a position that would put me at the center of American national security policy. Madam President, I finally managed. I'm honored by your confidence, but I have to ask, are you sure? I've been in government for less than a year. There are people with decades more experience who might be better qualified for this kind of responsibility. President Morrison smiled, the first time I had seen her expression soften during the entire briefing. Sarah, in my experience, the best qualification for identifying new threats is fresh perspective. You saw patterns that experienced analysts missed because you weren't constrained by conventional thinking. You followed evidence where it led rather than where people expected it to go. And you had the courage to brief your findings to the president. Even though everyone was calling you a rookie. She stood up and extended her hand. The National Security Council needs people who can think differently, who can adapt to new challenges, and who can see opportunities where others see only problems. Will you take the position? As I shook the president's hand, accepting a responsibility I had never imagined I would have, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I had been dismissed as just another rookie who didn't understand how things worked. Now I was being entrusted with protecting some of America's most important national interests. The transition to the National Security Council happened quickly. Within 2 weeks, I was moving from my cubicle at Langley to an office in the West Wing of the White House, with a staff of 12 analysts and access to intelligence from across the government. My new role required me to coordinate with agencies I had only read about, to develop policies that would be implemented across the federal government, and to brief senior officials on threats and opportunities in the technology sector. The work was challenging in ways I had never experienced. Every decision had implications for American competitiveness, every policy recommendation could affect relationships with allies and adversaries, and every briefing could influence choices that shaped global stability. The learning curve was steep, but I approached it with the same methodical persistence that had served me well as an intelligence analyst. 6 months into my new role, I found myself in the Oval Office, briefing President Morrison on a new threat. We had identified a sophisticated operation targeting American artificial intelligence research. As I presented our findings and recommendations, I was struck by how natural the environment felt. The nervousness that had overwhelmed me during my first briefing had been replaced by confidence earned through successful performance and growing expertise. Excellent work, Sarah, President Morrison said as I concluded the briefing. Your analysis gives us exactly what we need to respond effectively to this threat. As I left the Oval Office that afternoon, I reflected on the transformation that had brought me from a dismissed rookie to a trusted advisor on matters of national security. The change hadn't happened overnight, it had been earned through careful analysis, persistent investigation, and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom when the evidence demanded it. I thought about the colleagues who had initially dismissed me as too young, too inexperienced, too naive to understand how things really worked. Some of them had come to respect my work and judgment. Others remained skeptical of anyone who had risen so quickly through the ranks. But their opinions no longer defined my sense of worth or capability. What mattered was that I had proven myself through results. I had identified threats that others missed, developed policies that protected American interests, and earned the trust of leaders who made decisions affecting millions of people. The rookie label had been replaced by something far more valuable, a reputation for competence, integrity, and judgment. That as I walked through the corridors of the West Wing, past offices where history was made and futures were shaped, I understood that my career was just beginning. There would be new challenges ahead, new threats to identify, and new policies to develop. But I faced them with confidence earned through experience and the knowledge that fresh perspective, combined with rigorous analysis and persistent effort, could make a real difference in protecting the country I had sworn to serve. The president's trust hadn't been given lightly, and I was determined to prove worthy of it every day. The rookie who had started analyzing trade statistics 18 months earlier had become someone who helped shape how America responded to the challenges of strategic competition and technological rivalry. It was a responsibility I had never expected but was honored to accept. The END warning. Legal disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and has been created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely coincidental.